Almost 20 years ago, one of the most prolific Ponzi schemes in all of Utah history came crashing down. It left a string of victims who'd lost a lot of money. I'm sure none of you have heard the name Val Southwick, but that's a name I'll never forget because 20 years ago, I made it my mission as a television news investigative reporter to track him down. You see, Southwick was the mastermind of this massive Ponzi scheme that had hurt so many people. Here's how he got away with it for years and years, and here's what became of Val Southwick. Val built trust with his victims through what's called the affinity fraud method. He would meet them through church. But take notes here, because affinity fraud doesn't just happen in church. Affinity fraud can happen through a group of people with similar goals, similar objectives. It can happen between neighbors. It can happen in workplaces. The con artist builds trust, gets people to invest, starts paying those big returns with the hope that those investors will spread the good news to family and friends and bring in more investors. And then from there, it was run like a traditional Ponzi scheme, using money from new investors to pay those initial investors. At one point, he promised a group of investors that he was planning to build a big commercial development just outside of Las Vegas. 20 years ago, I got in the car and I drove to that big piece of land. And when I hopped out, what I saw was a whole bunch of dirt. There was nothing being built. When investors got suspicious and they started to complain to him, he would write them letters, calling himself an honest man, reminding them that if they went to regulators, well, regulators would just tie up his books in some drawn-out investigation, and they'd never get their money. Over the years, he was in the sight of state regulators. They looked into him, and they would give him like a slap on the wrist and tell him to not do this again. But he just couldn't help himself, and so the scheme continued. Eventually, in about 2007, a long arm of the law finally got to Val Southwick. He was brought up on charges, hauled into court, and eventually a judge sentenced him to prison. In the state of Utah, when somebody gets sentenced to prison, they get a parole hearing within about 6 months. I went to Southwick's initial parole hearing. Boy, it was packed with a lot of angry and distraught victims. They watched as he asked the judge for mercy, to get sprung from prison, to get back to work, to repay that $180 million in losses in that Ponzi scheme. The parole board did not bite. And in fact, Val Southwick's next parole hearing was scheduled for June of this year, 2025. A few weeks ago, I was on a road trip, and as I drove into Sin City, I looked to my right and I saw that big piece of land that he promised a development on. And there is a development there now, but it doesn't have anything to do with Val Southwick. But I couldn't help but think about all of his victims. Did they financially, did they emotionally recover? And then I wondered how many of them know that Val Southwick will never see another parole hearing. He died while serving time.